I'm really excited to kick off the content of this session. So this is our first session, and it's titled Innovating Traditions. So we're looking at futures for dairy farmers. We'll talk about what the future opportunities are and basically sort of zoom into this interface of transition and farms. It's one of the biggest challenges facing policymakers, as we know, here in the Netherlands, but also more broadly. We're stimulating farmers to produce sustainable and alternative proteins, but that needs to come into practice, and we're trying with this series to look at some opportunities to do so. We're also very interested in this sort of high-tech piece of the protein transition, but also want to dive into how does that coexist with farms and farm livelihoods, and how can policymakers sort of stimulate or facilitate that that the technology is adopted and supportive of the farm. So we'll have 4 presentations. The first one by my colleague Etske Bijl, who's going to introduce us to precision fermentation as concept, explain a little bit the technology behind it, and share with you what we're doing in Wageningen. Etske, I hope you're here.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, great.
Can you see me?
I don't see you, but let me see. Yes, I do see you. Okay.
Great.
Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stacey. So my name is Etske Bijl. I'm a food scientist at Wageningen University, and my specialization is in milk and dairy, and specifically milk proteins. And for today, I've been asked to tell you what precision fermentation is. And before I will explain you the principle of precision fermentation, I would also like to explain you why we are working on this topic at Wageningen University. So as many of you probably know, there is a growing interest for milk substitutes such as plant-based drinks in the past years. Here on the right of my slide, you can also see the increase in market share of plant-based drinks. And in 2020, it was already 14%. And I'm sure this year it's already higher. So many people are looking for ways to replace milk by alternatives. And there are, of course, a variety of reasons for that. Concerns about sustainability, but also about animal welfare, amongst others. And these are, of course, all very relevant societal trends. And as a food scientist, the question for me is then, if we consume these alternatives, do we then actually get the same nutrition from that? And what I found here is a very nice overview from the Dutch Consumer Association, which shows on the left traditional composition of skim milk, and to the right different alternatives such as soy drink, rice drink, oat drink, one of the most popular ones at the moment, but also some emerging ones. In the supermarket, you can find many alternatives nowadays. And as this event is about the protein transition, I would like to focus on the protein content of these drinks. And what you can quickly see in this overview is that compared to milk, soy drink is quite similar in protein content, but many of the other alternatives have a much lower protein content. So nutritionally, you do not get the same if you only look to the protein content from these alternatives. And of course, consuming a product is not only about what you nutritionally get from it, but also the texture and the flavor, the taste is very important. So on the left, there's some traditional dairy products, cheese, yogurt, milk, and on the right, some plant-based alternatives that you can find nowadays. And although a glass of milk and a glass of soy milk both look white, what you may know about these alternatives is that sometimes the flavor can be beany, or you taste some other things compared to milk. And actually, one of the hardest things to find is a plant-based cheese that resembles the structure and the flavor of what we would say a real Gouda type of cheese. For Dutch people, Gouda. So the question is then, why is it so difficult to mimic milk and dairy products using plant-based alternatives? And I just want to show you in one slide what's the difference in a protein structure between these sources. So don't worry if you don't have a background in biology or chemistry, just one slide. On the left, what you can see is a plant protein. So typically, plant proteins are very small, 2 nanometers, globular protein structures. And on the right, you can see a typical structure that we find in milk. So in cow's milk, about 80% of all the proteins are caseins. And these caseins are clustered together in very large structures, as shown here. So thousands of caseins structured together into a casein micelle. And these casein micelles are really unique in the milk of mammals. So of cows, goats, but also humans, there you find these casein micelle structures. And this is not so strange because mammals, of course, have very different needs than plants. So the function of the casein micelle in the milk of mammals is to transport a large amount of protein, but also calcium for the growth of the young. And the nice thing is that we, for our dairy products, also make use of these casein micelle structures. So actually the gel structure of a cheese or a yogurt that you experience is very much determined by the structure of these casein micelles. So you need them to make the structure of your dairy products. So what we can see when we make the comparison with the plant proteins, well, you can imagine it's not so easy to mimic a dairy product if you have a very different structure to start with from a plant protein. So what we can conclude is that it's not so easy to use plant proteins to make dairy products. Then what's the alternative? Well, in the protein transition, we're looking to many different sources. So on the upper row, we have our animal proteins. Then below that, several plant protein sources, soy, pea, but also potato. And then the bottom row, emerging sources. And also these emerging sources contain some plant proteins, faba beans, also some leaves, microalgae, insects. But actually all these emerging sources have a similar type of problem compared to plant proteins, because the proteins you have there have a different structure compared to the proteins in cow's milk. There's actually one exception. It's under the umbrella of single cell and fermentation. And that is, of course, you can guess that already, precision fermentation. And that is what I want to talk about in a bit more detail. Because the principle of precision fermentation is actually that you use microbes as cell factories. So you can let the microbes produce a specific functional ingredient for you. And this ingredient can be a protein. Well, the principle is that you give these microbes a piece of the genetic code of a protein in this case, and then the microbe can start to produce these proteins during fermentation. When you stop the fermentation, you can separate the cells of the microbes from the proteins, and the proteins you can use as a source for food products. Then the question is, okay, if we use these precision fermentation to make proteins, how can we then make milk and dairy products with these sources? So what I want to show you here is just the key steps in production of animal-free dairy products. If you want to read more about it, we also have a nice review paper written about it. So what you do, so you need to select a microorganism, for example, a yeast. Then you can modify that organism, so you give it a piece of the genetic code using recombinant DNA technology. And these microorganisms can then start to produce milk proteins during fermentation. And with fermentation, you have to think about these stainless steel tanks that are also used, for example, for beer production or wine production. So that's where the fermentation happens. And when these microbes start to grow and reproduce, they start to produce the proteins that you want. After fermentation, you need to separate the proteins from the cells, and then you can use these proteins to start to make products. Well, as I've shown before, in milk we do not have individual proteins, but they are assembled in casein micelle structures. So as food scientists, we also think about, can we assemble the individual proteins back in a type of micelle structure? And that we can use to make products such as cheese. And of course, a cheese is more than just protein. So there you also have to think about formulation of your products. What else do you need to add? You need to think about fats, about milk sugars, about vitamins. So this is still a complex task, but not impossible. In the media, you might have heard a lot about these developments, and I just want to point out that because it can be a little bit confusing. So in the media, these developments have been reported as cellular agriculture, lab-grown milk, cultured milk, brewed milk, clean milk, animal-free milk. Scientists typically tend to use the word recombinant milk proteins because that's the most accurate description, but of course doesn't sound very nice. So there's a new publication, a white paper from Formo this year, where they actually investigated what would be the best name for these developments. And they found that animal-free milk is actually the most acceptable and clear to consumers. So I will refer to these developments as animal-free milk. Well, this is all about the technology, but this event is also very much focused on societal integration and about connection to farmers. In the first place, these technological developments might seem something for maybe large companies, industrial biotech companies. But of course, these companies are also associated sometimes with words such as naturalness and also economic justice. And it's not, I think, in technology that's only relevant for these type of companies. We also want to think about successful implementation in our current supply chain. And of course, if we think about the Dutch dairy supply chain, a very important group are the farmers. So we are looking into opportunities, but also pain points for farmers and how we can address them. So how to bring technological innovations to the farm? Well, first point we're thinking about is when we have this technology and if it can be successfully applied, of course, the microorganisms also need a source for growth. So they need a source of energy and they need a source of nitrogen to produce the protein. So maybe the farmers can play a role in producing the feed for the microorganisms. Another option is to think about farm-scale precision fermentation facilities. So you could think about maybe a farmer can have a small pilot plant where they can produce their own milk proteins in an animal-free way. And finally, you can think of all kinds of hybrid options where farmers maybe have some cows, but also have production of some plant proteins that can be used for alternative dairy products and also have some precision fermentation proteins. And we can think of many options, but it's also important to realize that there are many developments in the protein transition, and we can also learn from the other developments. For example, I'm part of a large consortium on cellular agriculture, where the focus is on the one hand on precision fermentation, but on the other hand, we also have many stakeholders involved that are working on cultured meat. And one of these persons I'm working with is Ira van Eelen, and she is the daughter of the founder, of the inventor of cultured meat. And she is already one step ahead with her companies. And what she is actually doing is she's already thinking about decentralized production of cultured meat and about cultured meat farms. And of course, we can also think about these things for milk. So you can also have decentralized production for animal-free milk. There are many ideas. There are many of them are in different stages of development. So it's important that we learn from each other and also find a way to incorporate these good ideas while we are doing the research, not only after we've done the research. So to conclude, precision fermentation is a very promising technological innovation to make animal-free dairy products. It has a possibility to become more sustainable and animal-friendly, but of course, the research is ongoing, so we have to make the actual calculations. And for that, we also invited Rob Bakker today, who is the next presenter, who will tell us more about sustainability of this technology. And finally, the implementation of this technology also needs understanding of pain points and perspectives for farmers. And therefore, Zoe Ribaye, my colleague from Wageningen University, and Geert Willems will also explain the work they are doing on this topic in the next presentations. So I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll give the floor back to Stacey.
Yeah, thank you so much, Etske. A great introduction, and I think a great help to many people who are wondering what this technology is all about. We do have some time for a question, so please feel free to put your questions into the chat. I see the first question we have is small-scale facilities at the farm level and how realistic it is to be cost-effective at that level. And I think maybe, Etske, if you don't mind, sort of even sketching that a little bit more broadly, where are we in terms of cost for the precision fermentation proteins, and how do you see that developing moving into the future?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So we are really in the early stage of this technology. So we still need to find out what will be the final yield, for example, of the protein that we get after fermentation. And this, to a large extent, will also determine how economic viable the whole technology will become. So we cannot really say at the moment yet. However, we do have some expectations based on similar type of proteins that have been produced with precision fermentation. So for example, for silk proteins or gelatins, people have been able to produce up to 10 grams per liter of fermentation broth. And if you get to that type of yields, then it becomes interesting to really produce food products. But there are, of course, more steps in the process that we need to control. So it's still early. So we cannot really make an accurate prediction on that yet.
Yeah, very interesting. I think that's a little known fact that this technology is actually widely applied outside of the food industry. It feels very new, but it is already applied, and even in some cases in the food industry. So I'm just looking into the next question, and I think that's also an interesting one. Are there specific challenges for producing milk or dairy proteins with this technology?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I have to be careful that I will not give a too long answer to this. But of course, there are some specific questions related to the caseins that we want to produce, because the caseins are 80% of the milk proteins, so we start from that. And the caseins have something special in their structure because they have a lot of phosphate groups attached to that, and we call this a post-translational modification. And so we do not only want the caseins themselves, but we also want, or we think we need a certain amount of these phosphate groups because they are heavily involved in forming the casein micelle structure that we need to make the dairy products. But of course, this is an assumption that we need to test. So we're also working on that in our research.
Great. Yeah. A topic that I think you could give an entire seminar on,
Yeah.
on its own, right? Sorry for that big question. So another question that's here voted up 3 times, I think, an interesting one. So what sort of residues or leftovers are produced using precision fermentation, and what can we do with those?
Yeah, it's also a very relevant question because, of course, we want to make the best use of everything that we produce. And I think there are some ideas about how you could use the cells, maybe again as a feed source. And we don't know yet exactly what kind of side products we can expect. So we still need to determine, besides the proteins, what else is in our fermentation broth, let's say, after we finish the fermentation. So then if we have a good idea about everything that's present, we can start to think in more detail about how to use it most efficiently. And of course, this is also a question for Rob when he does his sustainability calculations, how to make best use of rest streams of the fermentation.
Yeah, definitely. So I see some other questions that are sort of zooming out, comparing between these recombinant and plant proteins, and also some questions related to the food safety authorities' approval, the regulatory approval. We are going to have a question and answer session after all of the presentations together, and I think those are big enough topics that I think we'll circle back to them in that panel presentation. And also just having a look at the time and to do our next speakers justice. Thank you, Etska. You're sticking around for the panel. We'll talk to you again in a moment. And I'm happy to hand over to Rob, our next speaker.
Thank you, Stacy. I'll get control. Should I just forward? Yes. I see my own slides, so that's good. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rob Bakker. I work at Haas University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, and I was asked to give a short talk on how precision fermentation contributes to sustainability. Just a quick further introduction. My background is in agriculture engineering with a master's degree from Wageningen and a PhD from the University of California, Davis. I also worked a number of years at Wageningen itself, and 8 years ago made a move to the Haas. I'm leading a research group on food production in a circular economy, which is one of 13 applied research groups. We collaborate a lot with other universities, and of course I don't do this alone. I have a team of researchers, and I'm also happy to see that some of those are present today. Yeah, so well, first of all, it's quite a challenge to have just 10 minutes to talk about sustainability and sustainability of food. So I will just try that, but I'm sure there will be many questions after the talk. First of all, what are the societal developments, as Etska also mentioned a little bit? Well, you can see that this Dutch news really showed that more and more sustainable foods are sold in supermarkets, in Dutch supermarkets. That's not research that we did. That's research by a monitor developed by Wageningen University, and probably also when you ever visit a supermarket like I did last summer in the United States on holidays, yeah, there are a lot of choices. For instance, there are a lot of different, for instance, eggs that you can buy, just as an example. What we also see is that you know, we are also seeing a lot of developments in food labeling, all related to some element of sustainability. And together with other universities, we did some research on these food labels, and we also found that, yeah, these because there's so many labels and so many different labels, it's often confusing to consumers. what we also see is that sustainability labels often focus on one issue alone. For instance, they only focus on animal welfare, or maybe they only focus on the carbon footprint. And sustainability, as you probably know, has so many more aspects than just the ones I mentioned. Now, if there are developments also in more integral, I would say integral food labels, I'm fairly sure that if you live in the Netherlands, you are available with you have seen a Nutri-Score, which shows some kind of nutritional value of products you buy. And currently, a sustainability score is in development, and it will be carried fairly soon by the Lidl supermarket chain. So if you shop at the Lidl, maybe have a look around. This is actually a label which is based on LCA, and I will talk a little bit more about LCA because that's currently the main method to have a good broad and integral measurement or method for environmental sustainability. I am not advocating particularly this food label, but it is very interesting to see that these things are now further being implemented. So, well, before you can talk about sustainability and fermentation or persistent fermentation, you have to also say, okay, well, how do we measure sustainability? And what is then the role of this measurement if you are dealing with a product or a process that's not even scaled up and commercialized, like in the case of fermentation, precision fermentation? Just a very short crash course in LCA, life cycle analysis. It's currently the most common way used by companies, by universities. Within LCA, you can look at a lot of different environmental impact factors. Very commonly, of course, greenhouse gas emissions, water footprint or water scarcity, the land use, and there are many more. It's also good to realize that LCA does not cover all aspects. For instance, human and animal welfare is not really included yet, and very important if we talk about, for instance, farmers or small businesses. Economic prosperity is also not something that is included. So it covers a lot, LCA, but not everything. And of course, loss of biodiversity is not yet included. Another development is that you see more and more international standardization of LCA methods, either by ISO or at the EU or even at national level. We have international databases that we can use. So researchers and companies can make sustainability calculations on the same base level. And what we also see is that the circular economy is also getting more attention. For instance, closing the mineral cycles. And if you live in the Netherlands, currently, of course, we're talking a lot about nitrogen and nitrogen cycles. We can also talk about phosphate. Phosphate is also a major nutrient used in agriculture today. So if you want to know more, you can for instance, click on this link to European Commission, which has a short guideline on LCA. So moving on, we are working on LCA calculations for various food chains and food products. And we also are collaborating with Etske and our team, as well as other researchers on the sustainability of animal-free milk, as we say. This shows you very shortly the current ISO methods that we had. It consists of 4 different stages, where you go in a very specific and standardized structural matter. You are developing your sustainability calculations, and This also means that you have to interact a lot with experts, those that develop precision fermentation, microbiologists, those that develop downstream processes, but also raw materials, because still for precision fermentation, we also need raw materials, and they will most likely also come from agriculture. Okay, then moving forward to precision fermentation, I just like to show you some examples from the literature where very specific life cycle analysis have been done. This is an example of a different. Earlier we were talking about casein micelles. This is a different protein which is normally derived from milk, beta-lactoglobulin, and very recent analysis. And very interesting here, LCA was used to not only indicate which specific parts of the process has an effect on, in this case, the carbon footprint, so greenhouse gas emission. There's the different colors in the bars, but they also compare different regions, different countries, in fact, where this precision fermentation would take place. And what you can probably see is that there's a very large variability in data from region to region. So this also shows us something that probably also when there's not obviously not one specific country or region where precision fermentation is going to take place in the future, but you do see that the choice of region will definitely also impact the sustainability. Now, our research deals with currently with raw casein produced, and you see some details on this. These data are not yet published, but I can show you some general ideas. And currently we are focusing on 6 impact factors, and we'll show you them on the next sheet, where we do think that also when you compare precision fermentation with dairy-based, a cow-based milk, that these 6 impact factors are probably most relevant to sustainability of the process. And here's some relative results. I cannot show you the specific data. I apologize for that, but just to give you an idea, here on the left bottom you see the 6 impact factors that we are using. Obviously, global warming potential, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, freshwater use, then specifically eutrophication, which is often is a negative impact in agricultural-based systems, and also acidification potential. And based on some early calculations, we compare this to a baseline of milk produced by conventional dairy production, and you can see that these indicate that in all cases there's a negative, meaning a positive effect on the sustainability of milk produced. This is an ongoing process, of course, but it also gives us inputs to give to researchers that are further developing the fermentation process. So in that case, the LCA runs parallel to the technological developments. But what is also important to stress is that even let's say the dairy milk production also has changed over the years, also has improved, and just very recently a paper was produced on carbon footprint by raw milk production in the Netherlands, which is also very relevant for our research. And you can see that over time, because of improvements in farm management, in more efficient fertilization as well as other aspects, you can also see that over time the carbon footprint of dairy milk has improved. It has gone down. So that also means that if you're going for one-to-one comparisons, the fermentation based versus the dairy based, you really have to see, okay, what is my benchmark, and not only the region, but also there are changes in time. So just to finalize, what we learned so far is that major impacts on the sustainability of precision fermentation based food products are obviously the carbon source, whether it's sugars or other types of carbon sources. They are derived mostly from agriculture, so they have can have an impact. The energy use, in particular, you're using a bioreactor. There is energy used for stirring, but also a lot of processes, the bioreactor needs to be aerated, and that also it requires energy. Very important is the overall efficiency of the process. That it's also how much protein can be derived from a specific bioreactor volume, and then earlier already we also talked a little bit about the co-product or the byproduct. In this case, the biomass. What are you doing with the co-product of fermentation? So some takeaways before I give it back to the chairperson. LCA can be a powerful tool in development of new fermentation-based food products. So we should go away from designing the whole process and then giving it to an LCA group. This research should go along, so there can be good feedback also back to the technical development. One-on-one comparison of LCA studies is quite difficult because there's so much difference in methodology and scope and region, etc. What was surprising to us is, for instance, water footprint or impact on water scarcity can be very region specific. Fermentation efficiency, I already mentioned it, has a very large impact on environmental sustainability. And finally, also let's not forget the scope product. What can we do with the product? Are we producing an animal feed, or are we going to use it for energy, or maybe we can go for more higher value products? Because so far we see that quite a lot of the scope product is produced during the fermentation. So with that, I thank you for being here, and I'll give the floor back to Stacey.
Thanks, Rob. Also really helpful. Love to have that kind of crash course, and then also dig into a little bit more detail and specifics about this. I see some very specific questions for you in the chat, a request for a reference and some more detailed information. But as we are running a little bit over time, I'm actually just going to ask if everybody would thumbs up the questions that are most interesting to you. We'll come back to those in the panel and go ahead and move on to Zoe's presentation.
Yes, and I forgot to include my email in the presentation. So if somebody has more specific questions, they can contact me at this email address.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thank you, Stacey. Thank you, Rob and Etske, for your presentations. My name is Zoe Roubaix. I'm an assistant professor in ethics of technology at the philosophy group at Wageningen University. And I want to share a few questions with you on what futures do we see for animal-free dairy. This is a work package within this project that Etske is leading, where Rob and I are also involved, that will officially start next year. So mostly I have questions and concepts for you, and I look forward to sharing this with you. We have Dr. Mariana Aze-Ueta, who will start on the project and who will be leading this research in collaboration with myself and Arnoud Fischer, also from Wageningen in the marketing in consumer research. So we're looking at this from a really interdisciplinary perspective. And this is important because cheese making, or how we use those new dairies, is not per se something new. So I was looking in archive images to kind of reflect on where we're coming from to better think about where we're going towards. And I was very interested to see so many technical drawings of cheese making that date back from 1800. What do we see in this picture? We see technology. And these technologies, they have become part of our traditional idea of cheese making. So this is what we understand today as cheese making, but actually it's not like this anymore. It's more technologized. And if we move towards this precision fermentation for animal-free dairy, maybe the diagrams we will see in the future and look back at in 200 years will look like vats with processes and input and output. But maybe there's something in the middle. And that's the imagery that one of our partners in this project, those vegan cowboys, is bringing with this idea of their steel cow, which is kind of referring to those bioreactors, but also keeping close to the idea that we're actually making something very similar to milk from cows, but without the cows. So where are we heading? What is the future that we're looking at with these new technologies, and how they affect the way we understand these traditional products? So there's this tension between innovation and tradition that bring about an ambivalence about who we are in the way of producing. So who are the new farmers, and how are consumers welcoming those new products or not? There's also ambiguity about the product itself. So our relationship to the product. So is it cheese? Is it vegan? Etske mentioned different ways that we were thinking about naming these products. This is a very important question to understand their integration in society. So how do they compare to other products? For what kind of consumers are they going to be? What kind of farmers are going to adopt them? This technology then comes to disrupt our relationship to producing and consuming dairy, because we have ideas of good food. So what do we understand? Is it good for the planet? So Rob talked about the sustainability benefits of these technologies. Is it good for animals? Because it will reduce our dependency on animal farming. So that will also alleviate their suffering. Is it good for our health? So Etske was mentioning the composition of the dairy in comparison to plant-based milk. What do we need for our healthy diets to be also good for the planet and good for us? And is it good to eat? Is it something we enjoy eating, sharing around the table with a glass of wine? So I have a French background, so I want to have my glass of wine with my plates of cheese. But it's also in the Netherlands a very typical thing to have a kaasplankje with your drinks after work. So it's something that is very ingrained in our culture, and understanding where it comes from with new technologies and where it's going is very important. It will kind of really affect the consumers' experiences, but also the producers. And here I have a photo of a cheese market. So who are the people we need to talk to that bring the cheese either to the cheese market or to the supermarkets? How do we make sure we talk to everyone, and how will the choices we make in the technology development affect their practices? So it's very important to think broadly about the different stakeholders that are involved in these value chains or supply chains, and how we can involve them in this integration of these new technologies. And the challenge also is that farmers and consumers are heterogeneous. So now I just said there are more stakeholders that we want to talk to, but if we focus just on those because they're the most accessible to all of us, we notice that we might have images of farming and consuming dairy that is very ingrained in older ideas. So for instance, these are paintings from 1600s on a dairy farm and on a meal. And today, these images are very powerful. However, how those products come to our table is very different than what consumers imagine. And it's also a very different reality for farmers who are under all sorts of pressure from environmental regulations, subsidies, and a lot of dynamics that affect the way they want and can produce dairy. So we want to understand these pressures. We want to understand the different types of farmers and the different types of consumers and how they relate to these pressures and how they also see a place for these animal-free dairy production. So when we think about dairy futures, we want to understand the value chain of dairy and interdependencies, because we are in very interdependent farming systems where wastes of one output are going to be used as input for something else. So we need to understand that if we displace something, what else is going to be affected? And we need to understand the ambivalences in the identity of the main stakeholders and the ambiguities that will come up with our relationship to the products, and how these materialize at different points in those value chains. And by understanding this, so for this we are going to carry out interviews and focus groups, it will allow us to co-design future scenarios for integrating precision fermentation as a novel way of producing dairy. So there are different ways of going forward for who will make it. Who is it for? Is it a luxury product? Is it going to be the new vegan default option? And how do we deal with what will be replaced by these new ways of producing dairy? There's been more research done so far on cultured meat. So what can we learn from this for animal-free milk? One example, and that's something that my colleagues touched about a few times already, is the idea of having a decentralized production. So actually this research was done by Cor van de Vele and Clemens Driessen, and Professor Cor van de Vele was my colleague who helped acquire this project and define this research that I'm now presenting. She presented an idea of having the pig in the backyard. And that's something that was also co-designed with participants in research that she did. So that you could say, well, you have your pig in the backyard, you send a biopsy, and then you will have your cultivated meat that comes from your pig in the backyard. What kind of scenarios are we going to find with stakeholders? What are we going to co-design together in terms of centralized or decentralized scenarios? This is a very exciting thing that will emerge along in our research, and that in my experience, you cannot underestimate the creativity of stakeholders when thinking about a relevant future for themselves. So we really aim to have an inclusive approach to our work. And with this, I thank you for your attention. And I wanted to show you another older machine for making cheese to kind of put in context again this idea that technologies help us change our traditions to innovate how we produce things we find are important. And I'm curious to see what we can propose for the future of precision fermentation in animal-free milk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zoe. We have a time for 1 or 2 questions if there are questions from the audience. I'll just kick it off by asking the question of, are there examples of technology being adopted down to the farm level that would be a model of how a decentralized approach could work?
So I think that's a great question for the next speaker, actually.
Exactly. I was just going to say that.
Okay, fair enough.
So I'm going to just keep, because he has great things to share about this. So what I can say is that, you know, if you look at different sector, like in my previous work, I looked at the bio-based value chains of sugar beet in the Netherlands with colleagues. And what you see there is that stakeholders like a cooperative plays a big role in helping integrate new technological pathways that has a minimal impact for the farmers, but brings them back some benefits. So for instance, using agricultural waste from sugar beets can create new products where the farmers themselves don't have to change much of their practices. And that actually doesn't answer your question, but that would be like a centralized way of looking at it. And there are decentralized ways, but I will let Gert Films talk about that.
Okay. And then there's another question from Roland in the chat that I think is an interesting one. He's a little bit curious for who are the drivers behind this research in the Netherlands? Like how did it come to be? And maybe a little bit of a question of like how did this project come to be, and how did different stakeholders engage with it?
Yeah, so I think Etske, please add if there's anything that I'm not presenting correctly. But so this is a project funded by the Dutch government on the national research agenda. So it's one of the areas that the government sees a priority when thinking about moving forward with sustainable food production. So in this case, it's really funded, it's a public funding. And when you look at the companies involved, they are startups. There are also bigger companies that want to see if they can diversify their ways of working. But I would say right now the main driver is public funding, and that's also confirmed by the recent investment of 60 million euros from the Dutch government in cellular agriculture.
Yeah, it's a nice example of how governmental funding can motivate and influence and support innovative startups to work together with academia to advance technologies. Thanks. I see a few other questions. I think that there's also some discussion going on, so I think we'll park these and come back to the questions in the panel conversation. And therefore take the time that we need to hear the presentation from Gert.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to make the connection with the farming practice, and and that's why I will talk about a bit of the background, what I'm working in, and then one of the example of a farmer who is who we can learn from, I think. My name is Gert.
Just a practical thing here. I think you don't have slides to share, is that correct? Or in this presentation?
I see a slide now.
Yes, I see Zoe's slide still. Zoe, can you advance us?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay.
You can request.
So I did advance mine, but it's not working for you. So
Gert, maybe if you say request control, there's a button next to the, do you see next to the arrows?
Next to the live.
In Dutch it's beheer krijgen.
Synchroniseren naar presentator.
I can press the buttons for you if you want. Just let me know when you need the next slide.
In view of time, let's do that.
Okay. Yes, everybody sees the first slide now or not?
Yep, we're good.
Okay. So I'm from Agriculture Innovation Brabant. That's a public-private partnership of a farmers organization, ZLTO, and a regional government, the province of North Brabant. Next slide. Yeah, and the goal of this partnership is more sustainable agriculture, so eco-efficiency, and also a socially accepted and valued sector. And that's socially interesting and also economically. And this partnership is already there since 1995, so more than 25 years. Next slide. A bit of the background of the partners, ZLTO, the farmers organizations, has about some more than 12,000 farmers are involved and member. And the province North Brabant, that's where my base is, that's a very dense area in agriculture. And it's also dense with people. And we have 2.5 million inhabitants, but we also have lots of cows, 600,000 and 5 million pigs, 25 million chicken. And we also have lots of intensive arable farming and also horticulture. Next slide. It's the approach we use. We have, different things we can hand to the farmers. We have a finance of €500,000 per year to support projects of farmers. And we support around 35 projects each year. And that means that we are engaged with some 1,000 to 1,500 farmers in every 4 years. We work with periods of 4 years. We also organize thematic meetings, around 4 per year, where policy meets practice. And we also have a good network. And in our board is also the chairman of ZLTO is sitting in the board, and also the regional governor, the regional minister of agriculture is in the board. What's also important is the support we give to the innovative farmers is not really financial, but it's also moral support, because only, say, 2%, and I think it's between 2 and 10%, but are innovative farmers. And innovation is maybe 25% technology driven, but I think 75% is socially driven. And so the social, surroundings of the farmers are also very important. This also has to happen for a long time, because it takes at least 10 years. That's what practice and experience tells us. It takes at least 10 years before innovation becomes viable. And the approach is based on the small wins approach of Professor Termeer. We already started 25 years ago, so we didn't know that this approach was there yet. The next slide. So this is one of the examples of the 30 times 25 years, so that's 750 projects. This is one of the 750 projects that we supported. And this is an on-farm dairy processing unit with direct sales to the supermarket. And this dairy processing unit is developed with Lely Industries. And the first one is, operation in the province of North Brabant, near the city of Tilburg, on the Dobbelhoeven farm. And the Dobbelhoeven farm is, the farmer is Guus van Roesel, and he's working there still with his father. And it's an organic farmer, and he produces around 1 million liters of milk. And now the milk goes directly from the cow to the robot, to the milking robot, directly to the dairy processing unit. Next slide. Here you see all the linkage of the chain. So the total chain is on one spot on the farm. You see the meadow where the grass is growing. You see the stable with the cows inside, which are fed by the grass. And you see the milking robot, and you see that on the left down, you see the milking robot, and the milk is sent directly from the robot to the milking unit, which you see on the right down, and that in 24 hours the milk is in the bottle, and the bottle says from which cow the milk is originated. So you can link the cow to the bottle, and the bottles are directly sold to say the retailer and other customers. And nowadays we have this one started in Tilburg, and we have now 4 units of these in the Netherlands are say working and are doing very well. Because I'm not exactly now because of the prices, but last year it was a double price of say regular milk in the supermarket. So more added value. Next slide. And Guus is an innovative farmer, so he's always thinking ahead, and he's now thinking of next steps. So he made milk, and last year they also made yogurt, and now the next step is to try to make something like a hybrid dairy product. And he's now experimenting with feed beans and with lupine beans and other beans to try to to do some lab research about what's possible with these proteins together with cow proteins to make new products. And he's doing small steps in this field, because he thinks that it's also possible to use this this milk processing unit to put directly proteins in from plant-based proteins. This was it. I think the next slide is the end. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's it's incredible work that you're doing, and this sort of moral support piece of it is so underattended, and yet what we're seeing with the social turmoil in the Netherlands, so essential and so important in the transition. So I think we'll just take a couple of specific questions for Geert, and then invite all of our speakers back for the panel. So here's a question from Elisa. The investment, it seems a high investment to do dairy processing on the farm. In how far can you evaluate now if it makes sense to go directly to precision fermentation, or does this investment sort of pay off in the long term?
Yeah, some farmers, they say it does, and some they choose for something else. And that's a calculation that every farmer has to make himself. But you see, the first, for example, version 1.0 was more expensive than version 4.0. So it's getting cheaper and cheaper also. So it's developing in the first years. But I also know farmers who have a dairy processing unit, but they made it themselves. But that's also they had they said, we don't want to invest that much. We want to put in our labor ourselves. So that's also a balance. And this unit was it was quite expensive, but it's already paying off. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great example of how there is margin to be had even in what has become a sort of bulk competitive market. There is a margin to be had.
This is not bulk milk anymore, because now he sells for niches like for cappuccino, for example. He is a cappuccino milk because some cows, they deliver a better milk for cappuccino, and other. So
Wow.
he diversifies.
Fascinating. I love that example. All right, I'm not seeing other specific questions for here, so I'd like to welcome back all of the panelists.